Time to rock and roll again. Okay, so, Glinsky likes to know what these pictures are on the wall. So this one, let me try to center it. There we go. Is from a couple of years ago when my son and I ran the Goofy in Disney World. And in the Goofy, you run a half marathon on Saturday, and then you run a marathon the next day on Sunday. Okay, so I can't remember. Oh, yeah, okay. These pictures are from the half, and then the picture over here is from the full, and you can see, well, you really can't see it, but anyway, in the background, the one where I'm running the full with the white shirt on, you see Cinderella's castle, which is pretty cool. So it's pretty neat to, as I say, to run a half marathon one day and try to hold back a little bit so that the next day, you have what you need to run a marathon. And actually, the mistake that I made was holding back on Saturday. I actually caused myself to stiffen up a lot because I didn't just run the way I should have. I was working on holding back, not running too hard, and that actually caused a lot of extra tightness. So it made the marathon a little more challenging, but all part of the fun. So anyway, that's from the Goofy, and it's a really fun event. And running just about 40 miles over 2 days is pretty neat too. It's a pretty neat accomplishment. You get a medal for the half, you get a medal for the full, and then you get a medal for having done both, called the Goofy. So that's cool stuff. That's what that's all about. Okay. So anyway, Sean, we'll try to continue to keep you entertained with photos. No, I don't know. Anyway, moving forward. Okay. So I'm seeing something, in a sense, positive happening amongst you because you are moving past just looking at the specific things that happen in a piece of literature and moving somewhat into like why they happened. Why did the author do things in this way? So you're not just looking at the individual occurrences, but you're starting to put things together. And again, that's part of what we're doing here, is to move you to this level of not just reading for the specific story itself, but also what goes into it, what makes it what it is, good pieces of literature are made up of a whole lot of different kinds of things, okay? And so we've talked about irony, and we've talked about character development, and we've talked about plot. What else? Okay, so this week we're going to talk about the role of the narrator, okay? And I already gave you the story to read, A Good Man is Hard to Find, okay? Interesting story. Anyway, we'll talk more about that in class in a little while. But I want to talk about the concept of the narrator. For a lot of people in reading a work, there is confusion between the idea of the author and the idea of the narrator. It's important for you to realize that they are two different things, okay? The narrator is the one telling us the story, okay? The narrator tells us what's going on. The narrator sets the scene for us. The narrator is the voice that we hear in the story, okay? The author creates the narrator, and the author creates the story. So authors and narrators are two separate things. Again, the author writes the story, the author creates the narrator. The narrator is a created character, even if that narrator doesn't have a name. So it is not the author speaking to us directly in a work of fiction. Okay, it is not the author speaking to us in a work of fiction. It is the narrator speaking to us in a work of fiction. Okay, and it's important for you to separate those because some people want to judge an author by the way they judge the narrator. Okay, so part of Edgar Allan Poe's reputation, and we'll read some Poe later on this week, but part of Edgar Allan Poe's reputation is based on the fact that he has these narrators that in general are a little bit off. Okay, and so the critics who didn't like Poe because Poe wrote scathing criticisms of a lot of them in the things that they had written. So they went out of their way to make Poe look bad. And so Poe creates narrators for us, as I say, who sometimes are kind of crazy, sometimes are on drugs, sometimes are drunk, that kind of thing. And so the critics created the idea that Poe was crazy and that Poe was on drugs and that Poe was a drunk, okay? And those things are not really true. Poe was a very hard-working writer, and we'll go into detail on Poe on Thursday. But because he created narrators that displayed those things, people thought that was Poe speaking to them rather than the narrator that Poe created. Okay, so I use Poe as an example because it's a really obvious example of how a narrator and an author are two different things. In the Birthmark, I did give you some background on Hawthorne to show you how Hawthorne was, somewhat spiritually oriented and got into deep things, that kind of thing. But in the Birthmark, Hawthorne is not the narrator. Hawthorne created that narrator. Hawthorne created that person who tells us the whole story. And even though it's something of an impartial story, so you don't see the narrator personally involved other than in telling the story, Hawthorne created that character. That was not Nathaniel Hawthorne. Okay? So keep those things separated. Okay? Author, narrator, two different things. Hopefully by now you get the idea. Okay? Okay. So we have different kinds of narrators. And you know this, I know. Okay? But I want to make sure that you understand that it's not just, that's the narrator. We have some narrators that tell us the story from the point of view of I or we. Okay? So they tell you the story as if they are actually a part of it. Not just somebody seeing from the outside, but they are actually a part of the story, and they will use terms like we or I in the story. Again, that's not the author. That's the narrator. That's the person telling you the story, and that person is involved. So if you look at A Rose for Emily, okay, in A Rose for Emily, the story is told to us from the perspective of a townsperson. And that townsperson keeps using the term we, we didn't know what was going on in Emily's life. And so it's like a person from the town who is telling us all about Emily and telling us all about the things in Emily's life and picking out different occurrences from Emily's life to try to help reflect what Emily's character and personality were like. Okay, so that's a first-person narrator. And later on this week, when we move on to Poe does a lot of first-person narrators. Again, a first-person narrator is generally speaking from the point of view of I. Okay, and so when Poe did that, and again, we'll talk about this later in the week, but when he did this, people were easily convinced that that was actually Poe because he was saying that. And again, narrator, author, two very different things. Okay, so we have a first-person narrator who speaks to us from the point of view of I. Now, you've learned English grammar. You may have taken a foreign language. You probably have taken a foreign language where you've learned grammar, and you know that you know what first person is. I, we, us, me, mine. Okay, that's a first person narrator. It's the person or people who are speaking to you, that and they're a part of the story. Okay, so they're talking about an I and we. They're really part of it. Okay. Then we have a third person narrator. Okay, and a third person narrator is somebody who is not a part of the story. A third person narrator, let me read a definition, tells the story from the point of view of he, she, they, her, them, that kind of thing. Okay, so a third person narrator is somebody who is observing, and is not an I or a me, and tells us what he, she, they see. Okay, now the Birthmark is an example of a third person narrator. The Story of an Hour is an example of a third person narrator. Okay, it's somebody that's not a character in the story telling you the story, as opposed to a Rose of Emily where the townspeople become a character in the story, really, from everything that individually that we see. Okay, so a third person narrator is not really a part of the story. It's an observer, almost like somebody looking at it all, from above and trying to tell about it. There are different kinds of third person narrators. Okay, you can have a third person narrator who knows everything. Okay, and so we refer to that as an omniscient third person narrator. Omniscient means all knowing, like God is omniscient. Okay, omni means all, and scio is the Latin word for knowing, to know. Okay, so this person has all knowledge, omniscient. An omniscient narrator knows everything. Okay, and so we can believe an omniscient narrator. Sometimes we get a narrator who doesn't really know everything, is seeing but doesn't see everything. For instance, The Story of an Hour. Okay, that narrator did not know everything. That narrator did not know what killed Mrs. Mallard. Sure, a heart attack, but was it the joy that kills the joy of her husband walking in the door, or was it really joy that killed her, or was it the horror of seeing that her husband was still alive, or the narrator doesn't know that. So that's not an omniscient narrator. Okay, that's not a narrator who knows everything. You see the difference between an omniscient narrator and a narrator, a third person narrator who is not omniscient. Okay, so okay, now there are, within those two subtypes, there are some other things too. For instance, we can have a first person narrator who is a collective narrator, and we do have one in A Rose for Emily. That person who's speaking on the part of the town is a collective first person narrator. He's speaking on behalf of the whole town. So he's collecting the thoughts of the whole town to talk to you. Okay? We can also have an unreliable narrator, somebody who thinks they know everything, but doesn't really. Okay? And we'll see an unreliable narrator a little later on in an unreliable first-person narrator in a post story that we're talking about on Thursday. But you can have an unreliable third-person narrator too. You can have a third-person narrator who doesn't know as much as that narrator thinks they know. Okay, so to some degree, the narrator in the story of an hour is unreliable because that person doesn't really know exactly what's going on. So we have subsets of narrators within first and third person. Okay. Now, in a story that's in third person narration, you can have discussion between characters. So you can have one character saying to another, I thought this and I did this. That doesn't make it first person narration. Okay. The narrator is a person telling you the whole story. Again, you may have a character that's talking within the story, talking to another character, not talking to you, the reader, but talking to another character. So that's simply dialogue within a story. That does not change the kind of narrator that you have. Okay? So I want to make sure you understand that narration isn't just, you see somebody saying, that's first person. No. The narrator is the one telling us the story, but characters can talk to each other and have dialogue in there, and those characters may not be the narrators at all. And again, the character may be a narrator in the story. The narrator may be a character that actually speaks directly to you, to us, the reader. And again, we'll see that in the post story later on this week. We see a lot of that. So we have first-person narrators who can be reliable. We have first-person narrators that can be collective. Okay, we can have first-person narrators who are observers, but talking from the point of view of I. We can have third-person narrators who are knowing everything, omniscient, all-knowing. We can have third-person narrators who are not all-knowing. We can have third-person narrators who are collective. Okay, so we have different kinds of subsets in there. So narration is something to think about. But again, the narrator, the author, two separate things, and the narrator may be a character in the story who says something to somebody else. But in general, characters in the story talking to each other, that's not going to be the narrator. Okay, so don't get fooled by the use of the word I. Okay, so you guys are doing well. I'm seeing you getting more involved and coming up with better ideas as we go along. Okay, and so that's what it's all about. So far, so good. Good work.